Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds Edge to Edge Transformation. And speaking of transformation, sometimes people start off doing real hardcore engineering and then do something completely different. And here with us today is Laura Swan. She is the head of Angels for Silicon Catalyst, and she herds us together when we are into investments. But she started off doing something completely different. Laura, tell us your story.
Well, I am from Wyoming, and there are not a lot of engineering jobs in Wyoming. So when I finished my master's degree in electrical engineering, I headed out to the Silicon Valley. And, it was a pretty tough time for engineers. It was 91, I think. So there weren't a lot of jobs. As a matter of fact, I remember when I was looking for a job, and okay, this is before the internet. So, you have to remember there was no internet posting of jobs, but they had on the news because someone had two software engineering jobs open, and the line around the building never went below 1,000 people. So it was a super interesting time. And I think, like many people's careers, just your first job kind of sets you on this path. And I was super fortunate in that my friend was working at a startup in networking, before there was really any networking. And he said, "Hey, we have this job open." And it was for someone to write power on self test. And since, I'd written assembly and programmed a microprocessor in my classes, they were like, "Hey, this is a job that no experienced engineer wants." I was like, "I'll take it. And if you need, I will clean your bathrooms because I want a job." So I started out with that job, and it actually was a really good job. It was my first group was in the software engineer. So in my early career, I always worked either in the software or the hardware group, doing very low level driver or firmware code. So it was kind of fun and it was the start of networking, and a lot of what happened in this company and the people was like a diaspora out to the Ciscos and the 3Coms and the of the world. These little companies where people started out. So it was really fun because it basically, my next 10 years I just spent in this exploding networking world.
Wow, those were the heydays of networking. And what was it like to be in an area which was predominantly dominated by male engineers in those days?
Oh, well, interestingly enough, my first startup, it was called Adaptive. The CEO was a woman, Audrey McLean, and both of the software managers were women, Anne Hathaway. And, so my manager was Anne Hathaway, who went to Cisco. And Audrey actually mainly did investments after leaving after Adaptive was taken bought by NET. So I think after that, Audrey McLean went on to do mainly investments. And as a matter of fact, I think my mom at one point sent me the cover of Forbes. She was on the cover of Forbes magazine for being an angel investor. So she, it was an interesting world to start out in. So I think in that first startup, because the CEO was a woman and the two managers were women, it didn't feel so isolating. My next company, there were no women in management, and I was the only woman in my group, probably for the next almost 10 years. So there were some tough times. I mean, I remember because when I started writing driver code, once a hardware engineer was done with their board level design, I got the design and I had to start writing driver code to put the board together. So I walked into some engineer's office once and he was like, "Why do I have you?" And I was like, "Well, hello, let me introduce myself. This is a person who never met me," and was like, "Why would I work with you?" And I was just like, it was the first time I really had someone overtly, without knowing anything about me, just refuse. And I can guarantee that I delivered that driver on time with almost no mistake because I was just like, I am going to make sure I get this done right. And I think that was maybe one of the things that happened with me is working really hard to make sure that you deliver. And I also think that when I switched to being a program manager, there was this moment where I had to go assign things to people. And I assigned like two different bugs, one to one person and one to another. And the one that I assigned, I went back a little while later and the guy says to me, "Oh, that's not my bug." That was it. That's all he said. He turned around, he was done. And the next person that I, asked him what happened, he's like, "Oh, it wasn't my bug, but I went and found the person who should have done it and I got them to work on it." And I was thinking, this is why my managers liked me, because I was more like the second guy. Like if I couldn't get it done, I worked super hard to make sure that I could find a way to get it done. Because I don't think there was as much outward pressure as inward pressure. When you're the only person, you feel like you better get things done right, or because you don't want to stand out anyway.
Tell us about your journey from being a device driver engineer all the way to being a trainer for angels and for entrepreneurs.
I think I'd been almost like 10 years doing device drivers, and then I went into program management. I went to Synoptics, which merged with Wellfleet to become Bay Networks, which was then bought by Nortel. So I went from being in a relatively small company to a little bit bigger company. And then when Nortel came in, it was huge. And that was the first time I worked for a big company. And I think I realized, and because I was also at the same time transitioning from engineering to program management. And I think when I saw how big Nortel was and how slow things moved, I really wanted to get back into a startup. So I left and went to a startup where I was the only program manager. So I saw this kind of what we call cradle to grave, from the design implementation of a project to the shipping it out the door. And that I really liked that job. It can be a little tough because when you're talking to the engineers and setting up schedules and stuff, you kind of represent management. And then when you talk to the management, you represent the engineers. So it's a little bit you have to be able to negotiate that fairly well. And you learn quickly the importance of the person giving you the information, because you understand, like, if this guy gives me a schedule that he says it's going to take him 2 months, it's going to take him a month versus another person who says it will take him 2 months, it's going to take him 4 months. So I think part of it is just learning who you're working with and learning to understand their ability to schedule out, and also this bigger picture of, because handoffs in a small company are incredibly important. This handoff from marketing. And there are a couple areas where you see when you're working in a startup how important that is. Like these guys who are out in the field talking to the customers, and that translation of what they need into what's being built. If that doesn't go smoothly or someone misinterprets that information, you can build completely the wrong thing or prioritize it wrong. So you need to have sort of really good people out in the field, but you also need these really good engineers inside who can translate what they're telling you into what the product is. And once you sort of get into that product mode, and after it's designed and you start in engineering, once it gets into engineering and everything's pretty well defined, because that first part is hard, you need to make sure it's clear. But once it gets into engineering, it's really about finding the right people, making sure it's built, and then it's tested. And then you start getting into these, alpha tests and beta tests and customer. So I think that job really helped me when I became an angel investor in terms of, wow, it really took me out of just engineering into this whole pipeline of seeing how a product is built, how it goes to market, the importance of having a customer and someone who's going to pay for it. I took several years off to raise my kids, and I think it was fun. I loved being a parent. I was super happy about it. But there's this part of you that also is like, you want your brain to function more. you know, it's great with your kids, but and so when I had this opportunity, Rick Lazansky introduced me to Sandhill Angels. I was like, oh, this is awesome. I do have all these years that I spent and this knowledge that I built up, and it's not working with the PTA. you know so it was really fun to get back into investing because I could take these skills that I learned. You don't think about it when you're an engineer, and then when you're a program manager, you're not thinking about, oh, I'm going to translate this into something completely different. But when I looked back after being an angel investor, I was like, hey, these were super good skills for me to use to do angel investing. And it's been, I think, with Sandhill, once I started, we spoke about it a little about doing due diligence. At first, it feels very overwhelming. I mean, there's all of these components, and I think in a large part, everybody has these great ideas. It's like your baby when you start a company, and it's really hard to get them to think about who's going to pay you for that, because they want to talk about, they want to spend, like, if you go to early entrepreneurs, they'll spend, if they have a 15-minute pitch, they'll spend 14 minutes on what they built and how cool it is. And you have to get them to switch that to 4 minutes of how cool it was, and then 10 minutes of who your customer is, how you get it out to them, how you make money, so I was like, and I did a pitch panel with Rick at one point, and there were loads of people on this pitch panel, and they said everybody wanted, advice from these investors. So by the time they get to me, like, all this really good advice had been gone out, and I was just like, look, you have to be able to make me money. For me to invest in you, you have to make me money. And I think we've both been approached by friends who, you want to help them. I don't want my fund to be a charitable fund anymore. I want to be able to make money. And I think it sharpens your skills after your first several companies that you've invested in go under. You're like, oh, okay, time to really focus and really get back to the fundamentals.
Yeah, I've been there, done that, and that's why I now never invest individually, but along with people who really know what they're doing. Laura, you brought up some very interesting points. It is widely believed that in big companies, you need people skills because teams are large. But even in early stage startups, the image is that you just need a bunch of hackers who can hack a product and it'll sell by itself. What's been your experience? How important are social and emotional skills at the early stages of a startup?
I think it's really important, because you're right. The thing about a startup is people just don't have time to worry about politics, which is nice. I think people who really like startups kind of like this idea of these really smart people who can put together a project. But outside of some, game maybe that someone can write, you need to interact with other people to build a product. And it may not be the one person, the one engineer, but someone has to be able to bridge the gap from the marketing guys, or maybe you don't have marketing guys, maybe, but whoever it is, like I said, you have to have the person who translate what the customer wants very carefully into what the team builds, and then run this across. Because, I mean, we can think back, like in my networking days, a simple board to start getting it into test, how many components are on that board? you need to have the manufacturing guys ordering the parts. And in our case, in semiconductor, you need to be working with your tool guys, Synopsys and TSMC, to get things built. We use IMEC. So it's a huge process. There's not one person. And I think that the really successful entrepreneurs are the ones who understand that things aren't built in a vacuum. You really have to deal with these other outside forces. You have to be able to deal with your vendors. You have to be able to deal with other engineers. And there's this process that happens, this handoff from one group to the next that has to go smoothly. And that's where that person who knows how to communicate, that's where they make your life a lot easier. Understanding you can't hand something off to engineering if it's half done, because it'll push your schedule out 3 times as long. There's no equivalency, because anytime you have to restart, it just causes havoc. And I think that the really mature people know how to think through these processes. And I still see it now. I love the entrepreneurs who have a lot of spirit and know exactly what they're doing. But you also need an entrepreneur who can listen and understands. And I have to say, one of the things I really love about Silicon Catalyst is you have all these people like us now who've been in the industry forever. So they can go, oh, from experience, from the pain, from the scars that they have, they can be like, maybe you should try this instead of that. And hopefully it is interesting. I probably, as I do more time angel investing, I watch how well they work with people who've been there before, these advisors. It's like we're not asking you to listen to every single thing we say and agree with it. And quite honestly, these poor entrepreneurs, if you talk to 10 people, you're going to get 10 different opinions. So they have to have their own very clear view of where they're going, but they also have to be able to sort incredibly well the important information. It's like a bandpass filter, you know? How do you filter out all the good stuff into, I'll say, like, let's filter all the really good stuff into helping us, And I think some of my the most effective entrepreneurs are those ones who are able to really utilize these resources. Silicon Catalyst has a lot of resources, and it takes a really, I can almost see who I'm going to throw money at by how well they take all those services, in-kind partner, you know, they can get up to, 2-3 million in-kind partner non-dilutive funding. How well do they navigate that road? How well do they choose those, non-dilutive funding type things? And if they don't understand it, find the right person, because our network is filled with people who can help them. I think, so many entrepreneurs, there's resources out there for them. And I think these ones that I've really enjoyed working with are the ones who know how to utilize those resources very well.
So, Laura, you've been part of Silicon Catalyst pretty much from the very beginning, but you've also been part of Silicon Sandhill Angels. And I got introduced to Sandhill Angels actually a long time ago when I was raising money, and this time around as a potential angel investor. What brings you to both these, and what do you see different? Are angel groups quite different in how they operate?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And honestly, the reason I joined Silicon Catalyst was directly linked to Sandhill Angels. The reason Rick started Silicon Catalyst was because so many of these software deals were getting funded. And when you think about it, it makes tons of sense, because for $100,000 in 6 months, you can spin off a software company. It takes a lot more than that. I don't want to oversimplify, but it's not like building a chip or a board or deep tech. So people weren't investing in it. So when Rick started Silicon Catalyst with the idea that TSMC, Synopsys, would provide this non-dilutive funding. But I also think that this advisor network that they have access to is equally as important because, as I said, you have people who have been there and done that. If you could help these companies avoid these major pitfalls that could end up, costing them 6 months or millions of dollars, that's a very beneficial thing. And so when I saw that people wanted to invest in Aridin because of the way Silicon Catalyst was set up, its ecosystem, its in-kind partners, its strategic partners, I was kind of sold. And so when I first started with their curriculum, and then I joined because I think I believe in it. I think there's this part, and I have to say, Silicon Catalyst has amazing advisors, and I think many of them are one. There's a certain joy in the Silicon Valley about technology that the geeks, we love technology. People just want to be involved, to hear what the next best thing is. A lot of our advisors, they may have done it for 30 years. They may have not figured out like something, but they want to know if this young person is going to do it or what the next step in their technology is. And I think that relevance that comes as you stay with it. And there's just kind of a geeky excitement. I think that there's some areas where it's all about the money and everything. And here it feels like it's more about the technology and the love of the technology. Because we have a lot of people who help out, who give input just because it's interesting to them. And I think those are the best kind of advisors you can find, honestly. So I think once I saw that that it worked, that this model that Rick had set up worked with the investors. He basically used this one company to test out this case. And certainly we've done it a lot of times since. But to me, it showed his idea worked. The fact is, Rick saw this years before anybody realized. And I think you can think about it. When I would go to these early pitch events for Sandhill Angels, I was super old compared to everybody else. These guys are kids. These women and men who are pitching, they're kids, And I was like, wow, I feel super old. And then I went to a semiconductor event and I was young. I was like, wow, I'm quite a bit younger. So the other thing I think Rick has done and was a bit prescient about was this idea that here's all this knowledge. There's decades and decades of built up knowledge that we would love to transfer to the next generation. How do you not let this decades of information just dissipate? So, some of it is I'm storing it in this curriculum. We're connecting these advisors to the younger entrepreneurs. That model worked. When I saw it like live and working in front of me at Sandhill, that's what convinced me to join Silicon Catalyst.
The supply chain has been disrupted, especially since the pandemic. And there's so much money coming in to try to figure out how to make robust supply chains. And we had some really good news about the UK helping create this incubator along with Silicon Catalyst. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it's going to play out?
Yeah, it's super exciting that the UK group, both the US and the UK are putting funds together. We have the CHIPS Act. They have a similar one, and they've actually started giving money out to incubators. And I think interestingly, the UK, especially since they left the European Union, they've kind of struggled to launch startups. And so the government is 100% behind getting these startups started again. The same with we have, certainly the Silicon Valley is alive and well, but the supply chain, as you said, was sort of cut off. So in order to not cut ourselves off sometime in the future, there needs to be support for these, ecosystems, the whole entire ecosystem. And I think in the UK, they thought, hey, again, because for 8 or 9 years, we've been working at the Silicon Catalyst trying to help and support companies. We've built up this in-kind partner network. We've built up a strategic partner network and investor network. And it's mature, it's been around, it's proven. And so the UK government was like, hey, this sounds like, since we have a UK group already doing this via Sean Redmond, they were like, yes, let's give them this chance. So they're very early stage companies. So it will be more of a 9-month incubation process versus our 2-year process. So they'll do an incubation, they'll do training on sales and how to negotiate. It seems like it'll be a really good program. And then if they want, because the UK government is paying for it, they have an option. They can either join Silicon Catalyst or go to some other place that's not as good. But I think, they're very motivated over in the UK. They're putting together their support and they're launching it fairly quickly. So we'll get to see those companies coming out of the UK fairly quickly. I think everybody, after this whole software thing, and quite honestly, chips have become ubiquitous. Even if almost any new startup is going to have to probably have some kind of IC. Look, when light bulbs have a chip in them and are run by that, then the world has fully invested, and embraced this technology. And I think that moving forward, even companies that didn't think of having their own IC before are going to have some sort of semiconductor. So we're aiming at this deep tech semi, and also people who just have a good idea, but maybe don't have a background in creating integrated circuits.
How is the whole AI revolution playing out? Because there's this belief that AI nirvana is going to change everything. But what kind of hardware will we need? What kind of a hardware stack platform do we need to make that AI nirvana happen?
Oh, it is truly fascinating. My master's degree, I wrote machine learning for controlling a power system grid. And, it was a rules-based thing. And you could see, like, even when I started in the 60s, there was a sort of push towards AI. And then I was kind of like the second wave with these rule-based languages. And now it's a completely different world with AI. And I think in many ways, it has finally, I think with these large language models and stuff, ChatGPT and Bard, it's gone mainstream, So even if you look at us, a while back, years ago, because you always see things earlier than the rest of the world, um, AI was a big thing and people wanted to invest. But then you had this like companies started going under who'd raised a lot of money to do AI. And so there was right before ChatGPT and Bard launched, there was kind of this like, we don't want to invest in AI anymore. It's out, it's done. And then ChatGPT and Bard came out, and people are like, "Wait, okay, we see it, we get it now." And I think with anything, you have these large language models. There's a huge power, that it's taking up. At the same time, people are in the world thinking about green. Let's go green. So how do you put these two together? So there's a lot of push towards reducing the power consumption of these. There's also an interesting how do we keep moving forward? Do we have the math? Do the processors, will they get past this? So there's this look at that of algorithms and math, and everybody's building their own compilers now to support that. So I think it's fascinating, this whole AI thing. And I think you and I who have seen, like we saw networking. I mean, even think of like the cloud. And when I started writing code, I had a Sun workstation. So we were all plugged into our Sun and we had Sun servers. Then as processors started getting like way more powerful, we could do work on our own. And still there was some cloud-based. So you see this kind of like change that pulls you, like in this case, from computing on a server to computing individual. The same with the cloud storage, then we had storage. We had these chips that you could store more. So people, everybody, all the companies had their own cloud. And then they were like, hey, there's this cloud. Why should I pay for this extra storage in IoT when we can put it out in the cloud? So it's like all of these technologies, you see them changing and moving around. I think that's going to be the thing with AI. And I mean, I don't know if you remember the IoT, Internet of Things was all the rage. You have this buzzword, everybody wanted to talk about it. Now, it's certainly also ubiquitous when like the light bulb I was talking about is part of that because I want to be able to change my light bulb. I want to turn it red or green. Oh, it's Halloween. I want to make that orange. And I want to sit with my phone and do that. So you have these changes that occur, where, if I put my investor hat on, I saw this IoT stuff. They're like, they're going to change the world. You're going to be able to set your heat while you're at work and do it when you get home. I mean, think about it now. That's just standard everyday stuff for us. Controlling my camera, controlling my lights, controlling my water, controlling everything from my phone. So AI, now that we've gotten the way to control this, I think the AI is going to come in and start. There's this, again, ubiquity of, hey, I noticed that you watered every day at the same time when the heat level is different every day. Like, why don't you change it based on that? So I think it's interesting. I think we'll see all these cool things happen because people can change things. I know there's a lot of fear. I went to a SRI and I think there for a while everybody was afraid, AI is going to eat the world and take it over and I think what happens instead is it just becomes such a normal part of your day and you realize it's fallible. It can be good or bad and you know how to control it. I don't know. What do you think of AI?
I I think the biggest difference I see, Laura, I was an AI researcher from the late 80s as well. Uh, AI was under the hood. Every single, automation system, whether it's your your dishwasher or your, using fuzzy logic, or
Hmm.
it's your automatic heating changes or anti-lock brakes, simple things like that. It is intelligent systems, right? But today, the power has been given to individuals. They can operate an artificial intelligence system, not under the hood, but they can actually do things with it. I guess that's what's making people scared or worried, as well as excited. Where do you see AI going forward when people are in charge? It's not just under the hood now, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I jokingly said to someone because I went to a pitch event and I was talking to the other judges and they were all talking about how scary AI was, and I was like, you know what? You can always turn it off. And then they all looked at me kind of funny, and I was like, I'm not even kidding. I think it's going to be like most things, when Google came about and everybody's like, oh, Google, like you can, what kid is going to do homework when they can just look it up, on Google. And so, and I think that's how it happens, and even Chat GPT, I wrote some stuff and then put it through Chat GPT and I had to laugh because I didn't think it was so much a creating, well, the way I used it anyway, it was like a marketing buzzword creator. It added flashy language to it that, as an engineer, I'm like trained to write the facts. Let me tell you what the facts are. So it was an interesting exercise to go through.
I use ChatGPT and Google Bard every day as I summarize my talks and I'm writing the book. And sometimes it uses flashy language, and I say, please use realistic language. Don't make it flashy. And it
Yeah.
changes it. There's a lot of concern with all the changes that are happening that programmers' jobs will go away, legal assistants' jobs are going to go away, and many, many, like, line editors' jobs are going to go away. What do you think is happening with the future of work? Will we have no jobs?
Well, it's interesting because I went back to Wyoming and someone asked me, I can't even remember what it was when we were whatever the new technology was. I was like, look, I remember when computers came out. You and I are that age where I mean, I think my senior year in college, we went from writing papers to the next year, everything had to be turned in on a computer disk and or printed out from the computer and turned in. And everybody's like, oh, these things are going to take people's jobs. And, so you had all these microprocessors coming and the Apple and it just, I mean, I think of the computer my first year to like even graduate school, how big of a change that was. And, this kid who was like, yeah, it's going to take all the jobs. I was like, I want you to really think about that. There were maybe some jobs, maybe this guy who sat there with a 10 key adding up columns, the Excel took that job away, but you still had to have someone who understood the underlying accounting and was working on that. And then think of what happened, how big and how many jobs are created by computers. Apple, all these companies, Broadcom, Nvidia. I mean, that just started a huge thing. And then networking came along. And all of a sudden, it created this huge job and all this money. So I think what happens is if you look at the past and you see how technology has created new jobs, it has gotten rid of some jobs, but it's also usually created new jobs. I think that's what's happening. And interestingly, with my own kids, I told them, maybe don't get a computer science degree, maybe learn something, but also now how to write code. So one of them is a, biomolecular engineering major with bioinformatics. So they did a lot of computer science. Because the other thing I heard a lot of when I was an angel investor is everybody was like, oh, we're collecting all this data. I was like, everybody's collecting data. Who's doing anything with that data? At what point? What are we going to do with all that data? So, and then they realize, oh yeah, we have to have someone, so these data analytic people are, doing well. But again, it's probably going to be a market that gets taken over somewhat by AI. But there's always going to be this leading edge of people who need to understand what's happening in order to automate it.
Speaking of Silicon Catalyst, where you run the operations, do you feel that even a new angel investors need mentors? Because it's not always an angel investor who gets it the first time around, how to go about investing.
Oh, absolutely. I think, I I would have to go back and find that article, but it talked about how they put AI up against investors. And what they found is in the early part, the AI, and this is just looking at, they just set the parameters basically. It did better. But by 5 years in, angel investors learn a lot. And I think it's completely true. Like I said, it sharpens your losing money, sharpens your senses. So after 5 years, you're a lot more savvy. It is interesting because in the Silicon Valley, it's a really like, I think the people who thrive are the ones who, what do you say, sink or swim, can swim. Because in my first startup, I had a little bit of guidance, but honestly, nobody had time to train me. It was sort of like I had, a few minutes to ask questions and then you have to figure it out. And so there's this whole group of people who are figuring it out. And so I think, at least in this Silicon Valley area, we're mainly talking about engineers who you just kind of point them in the right direction. Like, okay, here are the resources that are available. Go figure this out, or get on a call with me, or find ways to do this. So it's like being an entrepreneur. There's lots of resources out there. You sort of have to figure out how to find the right ones. And honestly, depending on how you learn, there's always people like Sandhill Angels who are willing to help. Like I think early I had so many people who were very helpful, just incredibly nice and helpful with helping me learn how to do these things.
One of the things that has intrigued me is when you're in an operating role, you have some control over, what you can do. As an engineer, you have full control over the programming you do, or the hardware, software, whatever you do. As a manager, you have a little less control, but you can use influencing skills. As an angel investor, you have much less control. And still, we see a lot of people doing that consistently. How can people deal with the loss of control and what happens instead when you're just an angel investor?
Oh, I mean, I think in some ways, and you'll see based on where the company is, you can have a lot of influence, as an angel investor, depending on how early you get companies. I will say, as they get farther along and, have raised more money, you have these ebbs and flows. And it's a bit like being a parent, honestly, because your kids do really well and they're like, I don't need any of your help. And then they run straight into a wall and they're like, okay, I need some help. And I think you see this with startups too. They start doing well and they get at their, under their feet and they're like, they have some successes and they think, I don't need you angel investors anymore. I'm moving up to the VCs. And then, things maybe don't go as smooth as they want. And I think this is also really good for the entrepreneurs is to keep, keep the people in your ecosystem basically who have been helping you all along. Because it is a bit like having kids, you can go back to your parents and say, I need help, and if you have a trusted advisor and they're like, thing is once you put your money in, you're on their team. Like you are pulling for the same things. You may get annoyed with them at some of the things they do, but you always want the entrepreneur to remember, I'm on your team. I want you to succeed at this.
And speaking of parenting, you're the mom of two twins. In what ways did that contribute to your success as somebody running a group of angels and a group of startups?
I think, honestly, it's kind of funny because I have 3 kids, and after my first was born and I went back to work, and I think when he hit the 3s, when they start having tantrums and stuff, I was like, I would go to work and people would have adults, full-grown adults would have tantrums, and I would be like, "I recognize that for what it is." And I laugh, but it was true. It helped me to go, in my parenting book, it's like sometimes you need to walk away from these things and not engage. And I think sometimes because there's a lot of pressure in building these products. I mean, I remember flying to Dallas to talk to WorldCom, and there were, 3 employees from Nortel there to ask me what I was going to say to them, because it's this pressure that you're trying to work in this environment. So I think, it was good to become a parent and understand that, yeah, there are some things you just walk away from that you don't negotiate your way through. You just walk away. And then you come back and then you deal with them. But it was fun. It was interesting to go from, not having kids and working all the time because I was in a startup. You spend all your life. And then I think there is something nice about not focusing everything on whatever it is you're doing, your job, your whatever, because it can drive you crazy. It's probably not good for your mental health to these startups be working all the time and thinking only about work.
So true. Yeah, there's so much we can learn from each other. Laura, it's a joy talking to you and being with you at Silicon Catalyst and now also at Sandhill Angels. There's a lot we can learn from each other. And to people out there, there's a lot we can learn from each other. Nobody has a crystal ball, and the world is changing super fast. And it's not hype anymore. A lot of things are changing as we speak. So if you notice some things that are changing and it's changing your life, we want to hear from you and we want to learn from you. Laura, thanks again. Every single time I meet you, I don't know how you do it, but you do everything with a smile. And that's something I want to learn from you.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Hmm. It was great chatting with you.